Hi, I'm Ariana Maki. I'm the 2025 U.S. Fullbright Scholar to Bhutan. It's my pleasure to be here, hosted by Bhutan Echoes Literature and Art Festival, and I'm going to be talking today about Bhutanese art, heritage, and innovation. Heritage as in what has Bhutanese art received from neighboring cultures throughout centuries of history and contact, and innovation. What have Bhutanese artists contributed to the visual vocabulary, and what are their unique innovations? In order to understand Bhutanese art, we have to understand the elements of many different cultures throughout the past. For example, the earliest is the Gupta era of India, which is 4th to 6th centuries CE, approximately the years 300 to 550. We also need to understand the Pala era of India, which is the 8th to 12th century CE, or the years 700 to 1150. Third, the art of Kashmir from about the same time as Pala India. Fourth, the arts of Nepal from between the 11th and 17th centuries of the Common Era. Fifth, the art of Central Tibet from about the same time, 11th to 17th centuries. Eastern Tibet around the 17th century and 16th century, and then finally what Bhutanese artists have contributed and innovated over time. So we'll start with the Gupta era. You can see here the map of the extent of the Gupta Empire. The darker the purple that you see, the more concentrated their power was in that particular region. And if we look at the style of their art, it's very distinctive. The robe that the Buddha wears in this example is very tight to the body. It doesn't look very natural. The folds don't fall the way, there aren't creases in the fabric the way that we would usually see when any being is wearing a garment. Secondly, we can look at the body type and recognize it as Gupta. Very broad shoulders, a very slender waist, and rather thick arms and legs. Many times in early Gupta art, we'll see that the hands are a little bit larger. This is because in the early forms of art, the gestures that the hands were making were very important. And so artists would make these hands a little larger to make sure that the viewer could see them properly. We can tell that this particular one, if we look at the slide on the left, was only meant to be seen from the front. And we can tell that because his back is very, very flat. It doesn't have the same sculptural roundness and physical presence as the front. If we were able to lift up this Buddha and look at the base of his feet, we would be able to see a couple of pegs which would have held him into his base, which was probably a lotus base. We also see behind his head, there's a small projection coming out. That we used to anchor in the halo that would be around the Buddha if his full image was intact. One of the most famous sculptures in art history for Buddhism is this one that's held at the Sarnath Museum. It is a beautiful example of stone Gupta era sculpture. The shoulders, just like in the metal image that we just saw, the shoulders are broad, the waist is thin, the arms and legs are a little bit thick, and the hands are in this beautiful gesture of teaching. Something I'd like to point out is if we look at the throne behind the Buddha, it only has a small rampant lion, a winged lion that's standing on his back and looking up. This is different than the throne backs that we see now, which are often filled with many animals, and it's said that it's the 6 perfections. Early on, we didn't have such elaborate animals in the throne itself, but we did have a beautiful, elaborate halo, which survives in this stone instance. We can imagine and expect that these halos that were around the metal objects were just as beautiful and compelling. It's very useful also to look at what's going on beyond the main figure. Sometimes when we're in a hurry, we'll look at the main statue or we'll look at the main image and maybe the ones next to it, but we don't always spend time looking at the details. In this one, we can tell that the seated Buddha is shown giving his first teaching at Sarnath. We know that because if we look down below, we see a number of figures holding their hands in gestures of respect, and then we also see 2 small deer and they're flanking the wheel, they're flanking the korlo, they're flanking a chakra, which is shown as if we are looking at it from the front side. So we're fortunate that we even have some Gupta era painting that survives at Ajanta, which was the summer monsoonal retreat for Buddhist monks. It's located in Maharashtra, India, and it's a series of caves that round a bend in the river. If we look at the art inside, if we look at the paintings, we're actually able to see a number of qualities that we saw in the metal and in the stone sculpture, but we also see things that we wouldn't know about otherwise. First of all, we can tell in the form of Kenri, who's on the left-hand side, that their paintings have a highlight. They have a line on their nose, on their forehead, a little bit on the neck, and parts of their body. They're highlighting the body to show a little bit more shape and fullness. It's in the Gupta era that Buddha images become more standardized. Before this, we had many instances where a Buddha's image would have bright, open, wide eyes. Starting in the Gupta era, we start having more images, and most images of the Buddha and Bodhisattvas with downcast eyes, meaning looking partly down, not fully open and not fully closed. Some things we recognize, though: the broad shoulders, the slender waist of both Kenri on the left and the female figures on the right-hand side. We can tell that those figures also, even though they are clearly not bodhisattvas or Buddhas, they too have downcast eyes, highlighted faces and bodies. And of particular note are the small flowers that we see scattered on the dark blue background. This is something that we see for centuries after the Gupta era. So now let's move into the Palla dynasty. We're jumping ahead from the 6th century to the 8th century. The Palla Empire consisted of a number of different small kingdoms and stretched, as you can see, all along the border of the Himalaya. It was during this time that the Dorji Tekpa, the Vajrayana, really became elaborated, more extensive, and more prevalent. We do have a few texts that predate the Palla era by a little bit. However, it's really during the Palla dynasty and also in Kashmir when philosophy, practice flourishes of the Dorji Tekpa Vajrayana teachings. One of the reasons we know so much about Palla art is that a lot of it survives today. Particularly palm leaf manuscripts have been particularly helpful in helping us understand painting. The manuscripts are rectangular in format, and they are leaves from a palm tree, where the painters and the artisans and the authors would write out the Buddhist texts, and people would move them from place to place. So if you've ever wondered why a pecha is shaped the way that it is, it's because it is using these Palla era palm leaf manuscripts as an origin point. These early Buddhist teachings become the new way of showing Buddhist art. What are some characteristics of Palla painting? First of all, we see increasing natural elements. We do see, if we look carefully, you can see the scattered flowers on the blue background, but we also can see extra plants coming out of the throne around the Buddha himself. We'll see some examples from Palla era where the petals on the lotus in the base underneath the Buddha and Bodhisattva and sacred figures changes form a little bit. Also notice the Buddha's hands. The palms of his hands and also the soles of his feet are red in color. We still see this in Buddhist art today. We also notice that not every figure is looking directly at us. Some of them are doing something called the three-quarter pose. A three-quarter pose is neither the direct frontal view like I'm giving you now, nor is it a full profile. Instead, it's in between. And that three-quarter pose is something that becomes much more common in the Palla era. But from an artist's perspective, if we're doing a three-quarter pose, it's really difficult to show this eye, right? It sort of disappears a little bit. And as a result, what we see in the Palla era is many times there is what we call a floating eye in art history, where there's a little bump that comes outside of the side of the head. So if you look closely at the green Buddha and the other Buddha on the other side, on the sides of the main Buddha, you'll be able to see that they have a little bit of that Pala era floating eye. And finally, note the shape of the halo. It's not a perfect circle around the Buddha's heads. Instead, it's a little bit closer to the ears and a little bit higher above. So we can sometimes remember this characteristic as a petal-shaped halo. It has a little bit of ovoid quality to it rather than a pure, perfect circle. If we go and we look at this example of a female enlightened being from the Pala era, we can see she has very much a floating eye with her three-quarter pose. She has the red hands and the red feet. Her legs are deeply folded close to her. She isn't in the usual lotus position or cross-legged position that we tend to see with enlightened masters and deities. Notice her crown is quite simple. They're just 3 simple points along her head. It's not a very elaborate crown. This will change over time. But what we see that comes from the Gupta era, very broad shoulders, very slender waist. So they have taken some things from the Gupta into the Pala, and then they have added something else. A quick example again, here's the birth of the Buddha. We can see the Buddha coming out of his mother's side, and on the way out he's saying thank you with a very nice gesture of respect. From the Gupta era, what did they take? The scattered flowers on the blue background, broad shoulders, thin waist. And from the Pala era, a petal-shaped halo, red hands and feet, the pointed elements on the crown, the floating eye, and the three-quarter pose. With Pala sculpture, we see the same blending of Gupta and innovations of Pala. Often, the sculptures will be made out of a stone called black schist. And we can see how even within the Pala, the styles change. Early on, they'll have a very simple and rounded top. They might even be a little bit smaller, but as time goes on, they become very, very tall images that are probably half of my height, and they have a pointed top rather than the rounded top of the 8th to 9th centuries. By the 10th and 11th centuries, we have a pointed top at most of the images, most of the stone images. During this time, the lotuses have become much more elaborate. We see much more of a double lotus and then a double lotus pedestal beneath, where we have a lotus on top and a lotus on bottom. And we get like these little tips coming out that really look familiar to us. And it's good to remember that during the Pala, there was a large elaboration and expansion of the Dorji Tekpa. And so we start seeing images that have yidam, we have yabyum, we also have images that are longku form. For example, on the right-hand side, that's actually Buddha Shakyamuni. It's Shakshatrupa. We would think usually that Shakyamuni would be shown just as a monk. But here, he is shown with a beautiful resplendent crown, but we still know that it's Shakyatrupa. And we know this because of the animals in the base. There are lions in the base of the throne. And if you look carefully, you can see that the great events of his life surround him. His birth is there, teaching, descent from the heaven, and then we see his parinirvana directly above his head. So this is Shakyamuni Buddha. It is Shakyatrupa, but it is him in a longku form. A longku form rather than the tuku form that we usually see where he doesn't have a crown. And that reflects the development of esoteric or Vajrayana teachings. On the left-hand side, you can see that it is a yabyum deity, but it's not, the yum is not shown in the way we usually see her. She's shown on the side, almost sitting on the leg of her yab. This is a tradition that continues in Western Tibet and also in Nepal. And then over time, the central Tibetan traditions change so that we end up seeing the yum from her back side. We see the back view of the yum. You might not expect it, but there were actually examples of Pala-style painting here in Bhutan. So as you can see here, These paintings are photos that were taken in 1984 from inside of the Changanka Gungkang. These paintings have been overpainted in the 1990s, so they don't exist, but the people who took the photographs published an article about them in 2011, so we're able to see these images as they looked at the time. If we look carefully, we can see that it's a very Pala-style lotus beneath. We have those double lotus petals. We have a petal-shaped halo surrounding the body of each of these figures, which represent the 9 planets. A detailed view of another one, we can see very much that there is a Pala floating eye. It's even coming to a point on the outside of her head. But what's interesting is that it isn't a pure Pala style. The garments, like the ones you see here with these big red shoulders, those are coming from Central Asia. So whomever painted these at the time, it may well have been at the founding of Changanka itself. Whoever painted them was aware of how Pala-style painting was from India and how Central Asian garments looked. Our third source is Kashmir, which is a long-standing long-standing center for the study and philosophy of Buddhist and Hindu learning. There were many practices innovated there. Many masters came and learned from one another, debated there, and created some of the most incredible and sophisticated literature in Buddhist history. Many of the characteristics of Kashmiri art were transmitted or moved into Western and Central Tibet, especially as Buddhism was largely displaced from India. So when there's a lotus present under a sculpture made from Kashmir, the petals will often be very thick. They're also very plain, and that makes them very easy to identify. If there is a throne present, the throne work tends to be open, meaning we can see through it. So in this example on the right-hand side, we can see there's a small figure holding up the throne and a lion on either side. So we know that this is likely Shakyamuni Buddha teaching. We can also tell that by his hand gesture, which is saying, "Don't be afraid," and the other hand gesture, which is holding the edge of his robe, which is pointing out to us that if we were to choose to follow the Buddhist path, we too may be able to have additional insight, accomplishment, and perhaps even enlightenment. Another characteristic of Kashmiri sculpture is if we look closely at the face, we can tell that there might be silver. The eyes might be silver, the lips might be silver, and also the urna, or the dzupu, might be silver in the middle of the head. So those are things that we see in Kashmir. The fourth source of inspiration comes from Nepal. In the earlier works of the time that we're looking at, in the 10th century, the works are a little bit stiffer. If we look at the figure on the left, it's a little bit moving to the side, but overall it's pretty stiff. Then, if we look at the changes that happen in 1 century, look at the way that Jampa is made. He is all the way over like this. He is fully bending at the hip and really moving in a way that is graceful. It almost looks to be like he's in the middle of moving as he's speaking with us. Notice how the clothing is quite close to the body. The garments are very thin, reflecting the climate. And also we can tell that by the 11th century, the foreheads of the deities get quite wide, the eyebrows are high and arching, and overall the face kind of opens up in a way that we hadn't seen with the previous sculptures. Something to notice about Nepali art history is that the Malla period created some of the most incredible, impactful works in all of Himalayan art history. The Malla period begins around 1200 CE and lasts until the 18th century. Under them, we have increasingly elaborate crowns, increasingly elaborate jewelry. We have scarves with much more motion. And there are still artists today who will work and make Malla era works that are almost indistinguishable from the ones that were made historically. For Buddha figures, though, they don't have that big bend to their bodies. They don't have that extreme naturalism, as we call it. They tend to be more formal, more symmetrical poses, and not too many curves in their body compared to if we are looking at Yidam and Jangchub Sempa. They too have simple robes with a minimal design. They tend to be a little close to the body, and the bodies tend to have Gupta characteristics, a broad shoulders, slender waist, and kind of tube-like arms and legs. Many of them will have what we call a bell-shaped torso, meaning it looks like their lower body starts at just below the rib cage, and it's shaped like this, like the bottom of a bell. But we can see here with this image of Jampeyang just how elaborate the crowns get under the Malla era, how incredible the jewelry is, the movement and naturalism of the body. Many of these works are so sought after that they will sometimes be able to convince an artisan to create a forgery that looks exactly as if it were 400 years old, and sometimes the art market gets fooled because the artisans remain so talented. An example showing how Nepali artists worked with multi-armed deities, deities that have more than 2 arms. Early on, we can see that they essentially stack the shoulder, so that the arms are essentially close together, almost stuck together between shoulder and elbow, and then they fan out from the elbow area. But overall, we can see the elements of a Gupta type body. We can see the beginnings of the Pala style also, and then the elaborations that take place under Nepal. Our 5th source is Central Tibet, Utsang. During the Chidar, during the later diffusion of Buddhism, as Atisha helped to repropagate Buddhism into Central Tibet, coming from Western Tibet, there are a series of monasteries that he helped to establish, and then others that came in the years after, between the earliest years of the thousands up into about 1200. We'll look at just a couple examples, Shalu and Dratang Gompas. First, Shalu Gompa. If we look carefully at the image on the right-hand side, this comes from a shrine of Prajnaparamita, or the Great Mother, Yum Chenmo. Prajnaparamita is the perfection of wisdom. She is both a text and a deity. Yum Chenmo, this image that you can see of this subsidiary figure, has many of the elements that we just spoke about. You're all getting expert at them now. A petal-shaped halo, red on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. The shoulders are broad, the waist is thin. There's a little bit of a curve to the body, a little bit of naturalism, and a lotus that has fairly simple petals. So we can see that Kashmir, Gupta, Pala are all coming together in this shrine to Prajnaparamita, which was consecrated by Atisha himself in the year 1040. A second example during the Chidar, during the early later diffusion, is from Dratang Gompa. This painting shows that in Central Tibet they were very much aware of and comfortable with the Pala style of painting. We can see this again in the shape of the halo, in the red of the hands. We can see the 3/4 poses of the bodhisattvas and the arhats that surround him. But we also see Gupta elements. We see some lightness on the faces. We see some lightness in their bodies. We also see a Pala-style lotus with more elaboration of the lotus petals. So there's no question that this is in Tibet. It's original, it is on the wall, it is as it was when it was made for the most part. But we also see something interesting. Did any of you notice that the Buddha is wearing boots? He's wearing boots and he's wearing heavy Central Asian robes. Some of the bodhisattvas around him, you'll notice that they have turbans wrapped around their top knots, around their hair. That's also Central Asian style. And we can look at the details on their robes to see Central Asian motifs. So at the same time that Tibet was receiving a lot from India, from Buddhism in India, they're also aware of the textiles that are moving along the Silk Road, and they're aware of patterns that are coming from other places, and they wanted the Buddha to be dressed in a way that reflects the climate as well as shows him in the most sumptuous garments available. Just on the other side is a figure of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. And he is shown in what I would say one of the most beautiful paintings in all of Himalayan art history. He's shown with his three-quarter pose. He has his floating eye, his petal-shaped halo. He has the different Gupta characteristics of the coloration on his face and on his neck. But if we look at the detail of how he's made, it's absolutely exquisite. We notice that there is a small goose, a hamsa, and from this goose's tail comes this beautiful, it looks almost like vines or flowers coming out of the tail, and it's elaborate, and it comes up and into the bodhisattva's halo itself. The workmanship is so fine, and we can see the ways in which some of these elements get drawn into Bhutanese art today and how they continue throughout Himalayan art in general. At this time in Tibet, most of the artists were working in one of two ways. The first of the two ways is the Indian style, and the second way is the Nepali style. This is an example of the Buddha Dunyodrupa, made in an Indian style between the years 1200 and 1250. If we look at it, it almost looks completely Pala style. It looks also Gupta. It looks almost pure India. What we see is the Buddha is just sitting there, red hands, red soles of the feet, petal-shaped halo. The bodhisattvas behind are sort of tucked in together. Some of their legs are bent up outside of the lotus position. We also have some small flowers scattered on the background. And then we see a few new things too. Down along the bottom, we see some figures who are set into red, discrete spaces. Not like above where they're folded up and close and bunched together, but down below. And those spaces represent something new that's happening in the Himalaya that's separate from what was happening in the arts of India for the most part. So this is Dunyodrupa, painted in Tibet between 1200 and 1250 in what is called the Indian style of Tibetan painting. Now here is Dunyodrupa from about the same exact time, 1200 to 1250, painted in a Nepali style of painting. We can see many of the same elements, shape of the halo, style of the body, but we also see elaborations that we haven't seen elsewhere. For example, look at the way that the side elements of the throne are made and also what's going on in the throne above. We see that there is a chusin there, a makara. This seems to be an animal based on a type of crocodile that appears in freshwater rivers in India. And what happens in Buddhist art is the tails of these beings become increasingly elaborate, vegetal and foliate, just like we have already started to see. And we can tell here's a small detail comparing the chusin from this Nepali painting with the chusin from the artist's sketchbook that we see on the left-hand side. So when we place them together, we can clearly see the two different modes of India, looking to India and looking towards Nepal. And along the bottom of both, we see these elements that are starting to be associated with early Tibetan painting. So we can tell that these relationships have been going on for quite a while. As the 12th century began, Buddhism started to decline in India. There were a number of forces that displaced Buddhist communities, and as a result, Buddhists, their patrons, practitioners, shifted. They came to the Himalaya, they went to Southeast Asia, they went to East Asia, and many of the artists that served them also left and traveled to these new places. So as Indian artists who had been based in India shifted outside, we have this influx, this receipt of new artists from other places, as well as artists who have been traveling around who are originally from the region. So early Tibetan sculpture has a lot of these elements from Pala, Kashmir, and Nepal. If we look here at this figure of, it's a form of Manjushri Yabyum, we can see the Pala-style double lotus base with these curls at the tips and this little pearl border going along, so very much looking outside. But then there are figures like this, Guru Rinpoche, where he's shown seated on a throne. There is a small lotus beneath him. Not all the masters have these big elaborate lotuses. Some of them have a throne beneath them that is much more extensive. This Guru Rinpoche is a fairly early image that comes from Western Tibet, and we can see that the artist has a very different style. The Guru is quite wide, a little bit heavy looking. He doesn't have that naturalistic bend to his body because it's reflecting him as having Buddha nature. Turning to Tibetan painting around this time, we can see some of these same innovations, and I'd like to point out the Ngor Ewam Chudin. The Ngor tradition is something that came along with the Sakyaps as the Sakyapa had a rise in power in central Tibet. They started innovating their own style of painting. This was heavily informed by Newari artists who were active, who had come in from Nepal and who were very highly sought after, not just in Tibet, but also in China. And we can see in this little detail one of the elements that distinguishes this type of Sakya painting from this era is a series of elements stacked together. At the bottom, there's a vase, bumpa, and then there's this long green element. Then there's a lotus. Then there's another long red element on the left-hand side of the detail, and then there's another lotus above. We see this time and time again in painting associated with the Sakya tradition. We also see it in a place you might not think of right away. If we take a look at Tamjing in Bumthang, we can look at the murals, and if we are looking only at the figures, we will see, oh, here is a form of Chenrezi Chakjipa, who comes from the Munsil Drunme, and we can see now, we can recognize the Pala and Gupta elements of it. Also, we can see Sepakmi Abyum from the Lama Norbu Jomso. And so if we're looking only at the images, we are learning a lot. We are learning a lot about Pema Lingpa's life and history. But if we look at the spaces in between the images, we can also find something else. Look at what, if we go in the Korlam behind Guru Lakang, there's the same exact element of the vase, the stretched out gem, and the lotus up on top. They're everywhere, even next to when you first walk in and you start your kora around the Sipe Korlo. What's right next to it is the vase and the gems and the lotuses, separating that composition from the protector deities that follow. What we also notice in the Ngor painting tradition, we can see here in this figure of Yonzen Kun Shokpel, the seventh abbot of Ngor. We can see that behind his head, those elements that we'd seen in the Chusin tail, the curling, swirling of vegetal and floral-like elements, those are now part of the halo behind his head, part of the throne behind his back. We also see at this time from Ngor painting this heavy use of curvilinear designs that had been in the back of the Chusin are now being found in the background of the painting itself. So we can see here in the halo, the green and the red actually have that same pattern underneath. Within a couple centuries, we have the development of two major styles that will impact Bhutanese art history. The first of these is called the Menri style, and it was founded by Menla Dendrup. In it, you can see this page of a sketchbook that was attributed to his student, Trenkapa. And this image of Droljang probably looks much more like what you're used to seeing here in Bhutan. The slight tilt of the head, the elaborate crown, the fluttering scarves coming up around the ears. Each of the proportions of the deity match a text that Menla Dendrup himself wrote. We have an idea about the importance of the Menri tradition and exactly how it looked because of this particular painting here, the Buddha Namparnangze, Vairochana. You can see the detail on the right about this very high forehead. The features are a little bit close on the face. Perfect circle of light around the head. But if we turn this tanka over, there's a very long inscription by the 5th Dalai Lama. And in it, he says that this painting of Nampar Nangze was made in the Menri style for the funeral of a Mongolian prince. So it's actual evidence of what style was being used in the painting, that in an inscription that was made at the time of the painting's creation. However, Menla Dundrup wasn't the only one who was changing the way that art looked. The other person was Kensei Chenmo. Kensei Chenmo is considered to be one of the contributors and innovators of what's called the Kenri style. And we can see his work at the Gongkar Chode Monastery in Tibet that was founded in 1464. An example of his work is shown on the left-hand side with the image of Kedorji. And we can see that there is much more action. There's a roundness, a completeness to the figures, the way that the fire is made and the halo that surrounds them. We can see that there are some shifts in how deities are being shown. Here are a couple of examples of the early Kenri painting style. Notice how neither of these figures, neither Virupa, the Druptop on the left, or the Arhats that are on the right, none of those human figures have a body halo. Only the Buddha on the right-hand tanka has a body halo. The others have halos around their heads only. That's a mark of the early Kenri style. In the Kenri tradition, each figure's proportions are a little bit shorter than that of the Menri style, and the figures of the Kenri style match a 13th century iconometric guide, meaning a guide that tells us how to paint and draw the images. We can say that the Menri and the Kenri together mark the start of what could be called Tibetan painting. It's no longer focused primarily on receiving and expressing the modes of India or Nepal. Instead, it's focusing more on local Tibetan ways of creating. The Eastern Tibetan tradition of the Karma Gardri is also very important. It's associated with the Karma Kaju tradition and the Karma Gardri, the Karma Gar encampment style. It was established by Namkha Tashi in the 16th century. And we can recognize it pretty quickly because most of the Karma Gardri styles or paintings will have open fabric, meaning fabric that is left unpainted. And it gives, like we see here, this sense of distance and sense of space in the composition that is a little bit different than the styles that we see in central Tibet, which are a little bit closer. Every part of the surface is full of pigment, even if we were trying to show distance. Another thing notable about the Karma encampment style is its reliance upon and heavy use of a Chinese-style blue-green rock. This blue-green rock began as early as the Tang dynasty, so all the way back in the 7th century of China, they were making rocks with these sort of fantastical shapes that are rich azurite, malachite, green, and blue. And here is an example of a Chinese painting where we can see just how familiar those rock styles will look to us. We see these in and all throughout Bhutanese and Tibetan art. So here's an example of the early Karma Gardri made in Tibet of the 9th Karmapa. We can see there's open canvas around his yidam above. We can see there's open canvas around his head. There is only a halo around his head and not his full body. We also see the blue-green rocks coming down out of the left-hand corner. And then later Karma Gardri. Here is Michepa, one of the Arhats, one of the Neten Chudru, and he's holding in his hands the stupa. Look at how much empty space there is around on the canvas. It's so open, and it looks very different from most of the works that are made in central Tibet and in Bhutan. So turning now finally to Bhutan, we've seen so much. We've seen so much of what's coming from India, what's coming from Nepal, what's coming from central Tibet. Now let's see what Bhutanese artists have innovated and put into the mix and how that has impacted the way that Bhutanese art looks today. There are so many painters and so many sculptors, including Mipam Chipel, Dunkar Lupun Duksamdup, Kaling Lupun Tenzin, Adro Nobur Dundup, Tukungawan Putso, Juk Norbu, and more. But for the purposes of this, I'm going to focus on just one, Tsangkhenchen Palden Jamso. Tsangkhenchen Palden Jamso was a Tibetan who was invited by the Shabdrung to spend time here in Bhutan. He came and he set up many places where he meditated and undertook different activities, but one of his major seats was at Menchuna in Paro, located in Shaba. There and elsewhere he trained many students, but when we read the texts, most of what we see mention of are the 6 Jamsos. So Sangak, Ngawang, Kinga, Chuki, Lodro, and Drakpa Jamso were his students. He was so important in terms of later Buddhist history that the 9th Jekempo Shacha Rinchen was recognized as a reincarnation of Tsangkhenchen. So we're seeing that even Tsangkhenchen's legacy comes back not just for art, but also for his scholarship and also his many contributions to literature, including the Namtar of Shabdrung Ngawang Namgyal. If we look here, we see these 2 paintings that are coming from Paro Menchuna. If you go inside, actually Tsangkhenchen is on the far wall and Shacha Rinchen is right next to you as you walk inside. So they're looking at each other across space because they are the reincarnation of the other. If we take the detail of Tsangkhenchen's face, which you see here on the right, and we compare it with that of the 4th Druk Desi Tenzin Rabge from the Desi Zimchu at Tango, we can see that there are some similarities of note, even though approximately 100 years or so separates the time of their creation. In both cases, the eyes are quite small, they're reddish, the nose is a little bit short, the mouth is small, and bright red lips. And we can see that the features are a little bit close on the face. Now, the tradition is that this particular figure at Tango cried at the death of the Drukdesi Tenzin Rabge. But we can see that elsewhere, that tradition of having the red eyes continues. So let's compare now if we put the 4th Druk Desi from 4th Druk Desi Tenzin Rabge's image next to that of 9th Jekempo Shacha Rinchen. What do we see? Look at the way the eyebrows are made. They curl up a little bit. Look at the forehead, the little lines that show that they're in concentration. Their eyebrows look exactly alike. They have broad noses. Look at their earlobes jut out just a little bit away from their face at an outward angle. We can see a lot of similarities maintain across this 100 years that span the creation of the Desi Zimchu and of Menchuna. We are fortunate that there is a photograph taken by Jürgen Schick before the 1998 Taktsang fire that shows the Guru Rinpoche at Taktsang. He described it as being in the lower shrine. It's unclear exactly which one that was. And we believe, though, that this was probably painted by Drakpa Jamso. If we look, the figure of the Guru has an extremely high forehead. The eyebrows come in a very similar way. The eyes are a little bit red. He has red lips that are small, and his features are sort of gathered on his face. So we can tell also that there are Menri and Kenri and a little bit of Pala qualities. When we look at Tsangkhenchen Palden Jamso's biography, his writing, he describes the painting that he's teaching as Menri and Kenri together, the Men-Ken Luk, the Men-Ken tradition. But what do Bhutanese do that's different? Notice the way that the Guru's outer garment has a puff to it. These folds are very regular. It looks like almost like it's standing up and holding him out of its own power. So these folds of the outer garment, when they are present like this, are very distinctive for Bhutanese art. If we go to Nobgang, and if we go to Talo in Punakha, we can see the same treatment of the robes. The outer robe is very high, very stiff, and it almost seems to be hugging him or holding the figure of the guru. By the time that this was made, this particular guru was made about 150 years after Paro Menchuna. Something else that Bhutanese artists innovate is this tying of a kada in front. It isn't always present, but when it is present, we can say it's definitely Bhutanese because nobody else does this. In Tibet, there used to be a tradition of having one kata that flows down. And this, we can see this at Tango. They continued that tradition in the Desi Zimshu. So between the time of its creation and the creation of this guru at Talo, Bhutanese artists have innovated the style of having two kata tied in the front of the teacher's outer garment. This is something that we don't see anywhere else except in Bhutan. So as we've spent this time together, as we're looking at Bhutanese art, look carefully. What can we see? We can see the fact that Bhutan has long been connected to, embedded with, and contributing to the networks that surround it, of pilgrims, of missionaries, of diplomats, of business people, people who are falling in love and getting married to people in other places. And throughout it all, art is moving. Artists are watching and learning from each other. They're selecting pieces and characteristics that are compelling to them that they then teach their students. And so when we look at what we call the unique Bhutanese art, we're able to say with confidence what came from our cultural neighbors and then what did Bhutanese artists contribute over history. There is so much more to learn. There is so much more to learn from reading historical texts, from spending time in temples, from talking with talented painters and sculptors today, from speaking with elders who understand art in ways that sometimes younger people haven't thought about it yet. There is a whole entire world of art and art history available to you here. And I hope that everybody gets a chance the next time that they're in any lakang. Take a little bit more time, look a little more closely, and see what you might be able to discover. Thank you so much.